Human caught alien girl stealing his food, but her story shattered. His heart thought the twin suns hung like molten coins above the Keldorian settlement, their heat pressing down with the weight of an anvil. Dust clung to every surface, turning sweat into streaks of mud on weathered faces. Metal rang against stone as workers packed up tools, a foreman's voice cutting through the air with a barked command for break. Steve Lawson welcomed the sound, his body aching from the relentless labor. 6 months on this site, and the rhythm had become second nature. Lift, hammer, sweat, repeat. But he didn't complain. The pay was decent, the work honest, and after 15 years in the interstellar marines, there was something comforting in the simplicity of building rather than destroying. He found his usual spot of smooth boulder in the plaza that, at this time of day, cast a narrow ribbon of shade. Dropping onto it with a grunt, Steve tugged at the strap of his vest, letting the stale air cool his chest. He unwrapped his lunch with the care of a ritual, peeling back the thin cloth to reveal his prize. A real earth beef sandwich. Cost him half a day's wages, but worth it. The smell alone transported him for a heartbeat grass fields, summer cookouts, things that felt impossibly far away. He bit into it slowly, eyes closing as the flavor spread over his tongue. For once, the constant grind of hammers, the clang of scaffolding, even the drone of distant hovercraft, faded behind the simple pleasure of food. Then, a sound soft, out of rhythm with the marketplace, pulled him back. A faint scuff of movement, close. Steve's eyes snapped open, trained reflexes kicking in. Just a few feet away stood a child. She couldn't have been more than 11, maybe 12. Her skin was an otherworldly turquoise that shimmered faintly in the sun, as though she carried a sheen of water under her flesh. White hair tumbled in wild tangles down her shoulders, framing a thin face marked with dirt and exhaustion. But it was her eyes large, sapphire bright, that caught him. A storm of fear, defiance, and hunger all at once. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, frozen in some silent exchange. Then she lunged. Fingers snatched the sandwich from his hand with startling speed, and before he could even rise fully, she bolted, bare feet kicking up dust as she weaved between the milling workers and vendors. "Hey!" Steve barked, half rising, instinct pushing him to give chase. But he stopped himself, lowering back onto the rock. His gaze tracked her as she vanished between two stalls, the sandwich clutched tight to her chest. Around him, the market noise resumed as though nothing had happened. Dren, one of his co-workers, ambled over, 4 eyes blinking in lazy sequence. "What's got you growling, Lawson?" "Kid stole my lunch," Steve said, more gruffly than he intended. Dren snorted, all 4 eyes narrowing. "Street urchins. You want me to call security?" "They'll round her up." Steve kept watching the place where she had disappeared, something tugging at his chest. "No, let it go." Dren lifted his upper arms in mock surrender. "Your call. But those rats are getting bold." "She's just a kid," Steve muttered, sharper than he meant. The alien shrugged and moved off. Steve leaned back against the boulder, stomach still empty, but he couldn't shake the image of her eyes. Not greed. Not mischief. Something rawer. Need. He'd seen eyes like that before in refugee camps on fringe worlds, in civilians clutching at scraps after battles no one won. Eyes that begged without words, that accused without meaning to. Steve rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. It was just a sandwich, he told himself. Just a thief, but the taste that lingered on his tongue wasn't beef and bread anymore. It was the bitter edge of responsibility, and he knew, damn it all, that he wasn't done with that girl. Not yet. The settlement's alleys twisted like veins, narrow and cluttered with refuse, a maze of metal siding and half-collapsed awnings. Steve Lawson moved through them with the quiet patience of a man who had stalked enemies before. He wasn't hunting today. Not exactly. But something had drawn him from the main streets, some instinct that wouldn't let go. 3 days had passed since the sandwich theft, and he should have forgotten it by now. But he hadn't. He spotted her by accident, a flash of turquoise slipping behind a rust-stained waste container. For a heartbeat, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks in the sun's glare. Then the movement came again, deliberate, wary. Steve's body reacted before his thoughts caught up. He circled, boots silent against the grit, until he stood at the narrow cut of an alley where she thought she was hidden. His hand shot out, firm but not rough, catching a thin wrist. The girl froze like a snared animal. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his, those same sapphire depths now shimmering with tears. Her small body trembled under his grip. "Didn't your parents ever teach you not to take what isn't yours?" he asked, voice steady but not unkind. Her lips parted, breath hitching. I'm sorry." The words were soft, musical, and carried the lilt of someone who had practiced his language in secret. Steve crouched, easing himself down to her level. He'd learned long ago that towering over the scared never earned trust. "What's your name?" "Libby," she whispered. "Libby." He repeated it slowly, like testing the weight of a weapon. "Where are your parents?" The tears broke loose then, tracing lines through the dust on her cheeks. "Gone. The plague took them last season." Her voice cracked, the final word barely audible. Steve felt his chest tighten. He let her wrist slip free, leaning back on his heels. "You're alone, then?" She shook her head quickly. "My brother. He's only 3. He's sick and hungry. The sandwich wasn't for me." The simple confession hit harder than a bullet. Steve exhaled slowly, trying to disguise the way it had landed. "You risked all that for him." Libby nodded, wiping at her eyes with a trembling hand. "I tried to find work, but no one hires a Phylaxian child. We're not welcome here." Her voice carried a sharp edge now, a bitterness beyond her years. Steve studied her closely. Thin, too thin. Bones pressing beneath turquoise skin, lips cracked from dehydration. Malnutrition written in every line of her fragile frame. This wasn't a thief's mischief. This was survival. "Where are you staying?" he asked, careful to keep his tone even. She hesitated, suspicion flickering across her face. A child, but not naive. She'd already learned the cost of trust. "I want to help," Steve added, softer this time. "No tricks. Just food. For you and your brother." Her eyes searched his, wide and desperate, as though looking for the catch, the lie. Finally, she swallowed hard and whispered, "The old communications building." "In the attic." "No one goes there anymore." Steve rose, extending his hand, though he knew she might not take it. "Then let's get you both some real food. Not stolen scraps." For the first time, her lips curved into a faint smile. Small, fleeting, but real. It transformed her dirt-streaked face into something heartbreakingly beautiful. "You're not angry about the sandwich?" she asked. Steve shook his head. "Let's just say you owe me one." As they moved through the winding streets together, his stomach growled from hunger. But the ache didn't matter. The strange, protective instinct rising in him did. He had no idea what this choice would cost him. He only knew he couldn't walk away now. Not from her. Not from the brother waiting in the shadows. The abandoned communications building loomed at the edge of the settlement, its once sleek towers now dulled by years of dust storms and neglect. Faded banners still clung to the exterior walls, scraps of a long-forgotten corporation's logo flapping limply in the hot wind. Steve followed the girl through a narrow service entrance, ducking under a bent metal frame. Inside, the air was cooler, shadows cutting deep through the skeletal hallways. The floor was littered with broken panels and discarded wires, but Libby moved with ease, nimble as a shadow. "We're almost there," she whispered, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cracked flooring. She climbed a rickety staircase, pausing once to glance back at him as though to confirm he was still following. The attic was smaller than Steve expected, little more than a crawl space tucked beneath the sloping roof. But it was organized, neater than the chaos outside. In one corner lay a makeshift bed of scavenged cloth and tattered blankets. A row of small items bottles, scraps of metal, an old data slate with a cracked screen was arranged carefully along the wall, the kind of hoard that came from desperate scavenging, but also a child's attempt at making a home. And there, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, was a small bundle. "Tiro," Libby said softly, hurrying to kneel beside it. She pulled back the cloth to reveal a boy no older than 3. His turquoise skin was paler than hers, his hair the same wild white but damp with sweat. His eyes, a deeper violet blue than Libby's, blinked up at the sudden light. The child's face flushed with fever, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. When he noticed Steve, his gaze sharpened with the innocent clarity of the very young. "You're pink," he said in a small, raspy voice. Steve blinked, then chuckled, crouching beside the bedroll. "That I am." "And you're blue." The boy frowned, as if correcting him. "Turquoise," Steve laughed, the sound unexpected even to himself. "Turquoise, right, my mistake." The small exchange seemed to calm Tiro, who offered a weak smile, before nestling back into the blanket. Steve's amusement faded quickly as he reached out to brush his knuckles against the boy's forehead. Heat radiated from his skin, far too much for a child so small. Libby busied herself with a few ration scraps, clearly embarrassed. "He's been sick for 3 days. I traded what I could for medicine, but it doesn't help much. The market sellers. They don't like dealing with Phylaxians." Steve's jaw tightened. He could see it all too clearly. 2 children left to fend for themselves in a settlement that saw them as nothing more than a nuisance. The authorities would sweep them up, eventually split them apart, lock them in camps. He'd seen enough of those camps in his years as a Marine. They weren't places kids survived. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Almost a season," Libby answered, smoothing the blanket around her brother. Her voice hardened with determination. "After our parents died, the authorities wanted to send Tiro to a care facility and me to a labor program. I wouldn't let them. They only take and take. At least here, he's still with me." Steve leaned back, studying the fragile scene. A girl barely old enough to fend for herself, carrying the weight of a dying child, fighting the world with little more than courage. His throat felt dry, and not just from the desert air. "This place isn't safe for a sick kid," he said finally. Libby's shoulders stiffened. "We don't have anywhere else. Phylaxians aren't welcome since the trade dispute. The governor's policies," she hesitated, then lowered her voice. "They want us gone. Some say deported. Others say worse." Steve didn't need the rest of the sentence. He'd seen worse on a dozen planets. He rubbed his hand over his jaw, the old stubble rasping against his palm. This wasn't his problem. He was just a worker, just trying to get through his shifts, earn his credits, keep his head down. But as Tiro coughed softly in the corner, and Libby leaned over him with the fierce protectiveness of someone who refused to break, Steve knew the truth. It was already his problem. He sighed and stood, pulling his ration pack from his belt. "First things first," he said, setting it down near the bedding. "Food, real food." Libby blinked, startled by the gesture, and for the first time he saw a spark in her sapphire eyes that wasn't fear or desperation. Hope Dot and Steve Lawson, veteran of wars he'd rather forget, realized something dangerous. He was in this now. All the way in, night had fallen heavy over the settlement, and the twin suns' heat gave way to a chill wind that rattled loose sheets of metal along the rooftops. In the workers' quarter, the streets were quiet, but Steve Lawson felt every shadow watching as he slipped through them. He had left the children in the attic, swaddled in blankets, their bellies full for the first time in days. Libby had fallen asleep sitting up, her hand resting protectively on her brother's arm. Steve had stood there longer than he meant to, watching them breathe in rhythm, before finally forcing himself out into the night. Taro's fever had worsened. His breaths were shallow, his skin clammy beneath its turquoise sheen. Steve had seen enough sickness to recognize when the body was failing. Food and blankets weren't enough without medicine. The boy wouldn't last more than a handful of days. The answer was obvious and dangerous: the Central Medical Facility. The governor had locked it down months ago, controlling every shipment of advanced pharmaceuticals, hoarding them like weapons. Rumors swirled of Phylaxian patients turned away at its doors. Steve hadn't wanted to believe those whispers before. Now he didn't have the luxury of doubt. He ducked into the back room of a run-down tavern, the kind of place where favors were traded in liquor instead of credits. Rix, an old smuggler contact from Steve's Marine days, sat hunched over a cracked table with a bottle of the amber rotgut they called whiskey here. His four-fingered hands shook slightly as he poured himself a measure. "Lawson," Rix rasped, his eyes narrowing. "Hell are you doing sniffing around at this hour?" "Need information," Steve said simply. He dropped into the opposite chair, lowering his voice. "Access routes into the medical facility." Rix barked a short laugh. "What? You catch some exotic flu?" "Last I checked, you humans don't need Phylaxian meds." "It's not for me." Steve leaned in, eyes hard. "It's for a kid. 3 years old. Dying." The smuggler's smirk faded. He stared into his glass, weighing the request. "You know Thrall's men are crawling all over that place. 3 checkpoints, scanners on every entrance, armed patrols inside. You try to walk in the front, you won't walk out. There's always another way." Steve said. HRIX scratched at the stubble on his chin. "Maintenance tunnels. They run under the whole complex, connect to the old comms arrays. But the access codes change weekly. Without those, you're just another corpse in a vent shaft. Can you get them?" A long pause. "Maybe." Rix's gaze flicked up, measuring him. "But it'll cost you. That tan whiskey you've been hoarding since deployment." "All of it," Steve grimaced. His last tie to Earth, a taste of a life long gone. But then he thought of Tiro's shallow breaths, Libby's wide, unblinking eyes. Done. By the time Steve returned to the comms building, dawn was staining the sky a muted orange. Libby was awake, hair wild, eyes red from crying, but steady. She looked at him like someone drowning looked at a rope. "Did you find a way?" she asked. Steve nodded, setting down the small sack of food he'd bartered for on the way back. "We'll need to move soon. The medicine's in there, and I've got us a route. Won't be easy." Her gaze flickered to her brother, still restless in fever dreams. She swallowed hard, then lifted her chin. "I'll go with you. I know what he needs." Steve studied her, this thin scrap of a girl who had already carried burdens too heavy for her age. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes held the same defiance he'd seen when she stole his sandwich. A spark that refused to die. "All right," he said quietly. "We go together. But you stay close. Understand?" Libby nodded once, sharp and determined. Steve glanced toward the boy's sleeping form, then back to her. The Marine in him stirred, the part that lived for impossible odds. "Then we're going to steal some medicine," he muttered, more to himself than her thought, and for the first time in years. Steve Lawson felt the old fire rise, the certainty that a mission, no matter how suicidal, had to be finished. This one wasn't for command or country. This one was for a child's life, for a family that wasn't his, yet somehow already was. The central plaza of the Kaldorian settlement was a furnace of light and tension. Twin suns hammered down on the stone square, turning every shadow sharp, every movement conspicuous. Steve Lawson moved through the crowd with his head low, Libby at his side. She wore a patched hood pulled forward to hide her hair, but her sapphire eyes darted restlessly, watching for patrols. In his jacket, tucked out of sight, Steve carried a small pack. Inside it, the stolen medicine. Getting it hadn't been easy. Hours of crawling through maintenance shafts, slick with condensation, dodging patrols, and finally, the near disaster when the biometric lock had nearly trapped them. It had been Nerea, the Phylaxian medical officer they'd stumbled across, who had tipped the balance. She had looked at Libby, listened to her plea, and made a choice that risked her career and her life. With swift hands, she had keyed the lock and pressed the antibiotics into Steve's grip. For your brother. But the governor will not forgive this. Be quick. Now, in the heart of the settlement, Steve felt the truth of her warning. Security hovercrafts hummed overhead. Uniformed soldiers ringed the plaza, rifles gleaming in the sun. At the center, raised on a temporary stage, stood Governor Threll himself, draped in ceremonial robes that glittered like molten bronze. His voice boomed through amplifiers, smooth and venomous all at once. "These are dangerous times," Threll declared. "Our great settlement faces threats from within. Phylaxian agitators spread disease, chaos, and sedition. But under my rule, we will remain strong. We will remain pure." Behind him, a row of human workers stood under guard. Steve's stomach clenched. He recognized them as foremen, a pair of laborers from his shift, even Rix, his smuggler contact. All of them cuffed, faces tight with fear. Libby's breath caught. "Why are they here?" "Leverage," Steve said grimly. "He wants me. He knows I took the medicine." As if on cue, Threll's gaze swept the crowd, his amplified voice dripping with triumph. "The human fugitive Steve Lawson has betrayed us all. He has harbored Phylaxian criminals and stolen from the medical reserves meant for honest Kaldorian citizens. Step forward, Lawson. Show yourself, and I may yet spare these workers." The plaza buzzed with murmurs. Steve felt eyes turning, searching. He could slip away, hide in the alleys, vanish into the desert. But the men on that stage would pay the price. And Libby and Taro would never be safe. He touched the girl's shoulder gently. "Stay close. Don't run." And he stepped into the open. "I believe you're looking for me," he called, his voice carrying over the crowd. A ripple of shock spread through the assembly. Guards raised rifles, but Threll lifted a hand, his thin lips curling into a satisfied smile. "How considerate," the governor purred. "The traitor reveals himself." Steve climbed the steps slowly, ignoring the rifles that tracked his every move. He planted himself at the edge of the stage, meeting the governor's eyes without flinching. "These people," he said, jerking his chin toward the hostages, "are innocent. Your quarrel is with me. Let them go." Threll's smile widened. "You have no position to negotiate, human. You are a criminal, a thief. Am I?" Steve's voice rose, carried by anger he hadn't realized was boiling inside him. He turned toward the crowd, letting them see his face, hear his words. "Or am I a man who refused to let children die because of your lies? You say the Phylaxians are dangerous. I've seen them. A little girl who only wanted to feed her brother. A boy so sick he could barely breathe. And you denied them medicine. Why?" A murmur swept the crowd. Threll's eyes narrowed. "Lies, propaganda. Then prove it," Steve shot back. "Explain why your own medical officer smuggled out evidence." Explain why files have already been sent to the Galactic Council. That name struck like a hammer blow. A plaza erupted in whispers. Threll's composure cracked, fury bleeding into his expression. "Seize him!" he roared. Guards surged forward. But before they reached Steve, a new sound cut across the plaza, the sharp crackle of the communication screens flaring to life. Every display in the square shifted to a single seal, the insignia of the Galactic Council. A voice rang out, calm and authoritative. "Citizens of the Caldorian settlement, this broadcast is official. Evidence of medical discrimination and abuse of power has reached us. Governor Threll is hereby suspended pending full investigation. Effective immediately, Elder Coven assumes temporary authority." The crowd gasped. On screen, Naria appeared, her silver eyes steady, her words precise as she outlined the governor's crimes. And in her arms, small but alive, was Tiro, his fever broken, his violet eyes blinking curiously into the camera. The plaza went silent. Then, slowly, voices rose, first a few, then dozens. Humans and Caldorans alike shouted in defiance, in relief, in fury at what had been hidden from them. Threll shouted back, face contorted, but his guards hesitated. Some lowered their weapons. Steve felt Libby slip her hand into his. Her small fingers trembled, but her grip was iron. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" Steve looked at the sea of faces, at the broken tyrant, at the screens filled with truth that could no longer be silenced. For the first time since he'd arrived on this harsh world, he let himself believe it. "Yeah, kid," he said. "We're going to be all right." 3 days later, the settlement no longer felt like the same place. The banners praising Governor Threll had been torn down, replaced with the insignia of the temporary council. The guards who once prowled the streets with rifles slung across their shoulders now stood uneasily beside newly appointed peacekeepers, their loyalties shifting with the winds of power. Whispers followed Steve Lawson. Wherever he walked, some curious, some grateful, some suspicious. He ignored them all. The only thing that mattered was waiting. He stood in the spaceport arrival bay, hands shoved into the pockets of his warm jacket, scanning the docking tunnel with a tightness in his chest that no battle had ever given him. Libby paced nearby, her tangled hair hastily braided, her sapphire eyes darting toward the sealed hatch every few seconds. She tried to hide her nerves with a show of confidence, but Steve could see the tremble in her fingers. The hiss of hydraulics filled the air as the Galactic Council transport docked. The hatch slid open. Steve's breath caught as the first figure stepped through Naria. She moved with quiet poise, her silver eyes locking on him instantly. In her arms was Tiro, wrapped in a clean blanket, his skin no longer fever-flushed, but glowing with the healthy, turquoise sheen of recovery. The boy spotted Steve and wriggled free, bolting forward on small but steady legs. "Steve!" he cried, voice bright with joy. Steve dropped to one knee, arms open, and caught the boy as he leapt into him. He spun him once, laughing as the child's delighted giggle rang out. "Looking good, little man," Steve said, brushing a hand over the boy's now cool forehead. Libby joined them in an instant, throwing her arms around both her brother and Steve. For a moment, the three of them clung together. A knot of mismatched colors: turquoise, pale pink, sapphire, and violet eyes, all bound by something stronger than blood. When Steve finally looked up, Naria was there, closer than he realized, her expression softened by a smile that made his chest ache. Without hesitation, he reached out and drew her into the embrace. Their lips met briefly, the kiss speaking more than words could carry. "Welcome home," he murmured. "Home," she repeated, as though testing the word on her tongue. Then she gave a small, certain nod. "Yes, I suppose it is now." Later, as they walked through the settlement's market together, Naria explained the council's ruling. Threll had been taken into custody, awaiting trial for crimes against sentient rights. A mixed species governance board was being formed to oversee reforms, with her appointed to lead the new medical administration. "And the children?" Steve asked. "The council has granted us joint guardianship," she said, her silver eyes gleaming as she looked at him. "If you're willing." Steve stopped, turning fully to her, heart pounding harder than it ever had in combat. "Are you asking me to start a family with you, Doctor?" "I believe we already have," Nerea replied softly, glancing toward Libby and Taro, who were laughing together at a vendor stall, their small hands clutching sweets they'd been given. "I'm merely suggesting we make it official." Steve pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, despite their different species, their different worlds. "Then my answer is yes." They sealed it with a kiss, a vow made not in ceremony, but in choice, the kind that mattered most. Libby came bouncing back, tugging at Steve's sleeve. "Steve, the vendor's selling sandwiches, real Earth ones, like before." Steve barked a laugh, the memory flashing vivid in his mind. "Well then," he said, ruffling her hair, "I think you owe me one." Her sapphire eyes sparkled with mischief as she pressed a wrapped sandwich into his hand. "I suppose I do." Steve looked around at the strange, shifting settlement, humans and Calderans working side by side, Phylaxian refugees daring to show themselves in daylight, voices of laughter where once there had been only fear. And at the heart of it, the four of them. A soldier who thought he'd left his wars behind, a doctor who chose courage over safety, and two children who had taught him what family truly meant. As they walked on together, the suns dipping toward the horizon, Steve Lawson felt something settle deep inside him. Not the restless hunger of battle, not the emptiness of exile. Something steadier. A home.